Feel free. Do you believe that your path in life was mostly a conscious choice? Yeah, me neither. I mean, I made a lot of choices, but mostly between options that I didn't like. If you'd like to hear a thoughtful opinion on why that is, and what we might do about it to change, then stick around. Hi, I'm XCG, and today we're going to return to discuss controversial social critic Ivan Illich and his book, Tools for Conviviality. As I stated in my first video, we've got here a really radical and complicated book. This isn't a book that you absorb and discuss in a single sitting. My first video on this topic gives an overview of Illich's concerns with modern society. I've linked that video above, and eventually, I'll create a playlist for Illich-themed videos. For those of you who didn't watch my earlier video, I'll attempt to give you the 2-minute overview. Illich was a 20th century Catholic priest, a teacher, a public intellectual, and a controversial figure. This caused him conflict with the Vatican. Frustrating the Vatican does grant him some credibility in my eyes. The book, Tools for Conviviality, was published in the early 1970s and is consistent with his overall views about society. His primary thesis is that modern society is highly alienating, damages humanity, and disembowels our communities. His thinking parallels other leftist thinkers, and he shares views with Marx, although Illich disagrees with Marx in a number of significant ways. Tools for Conviviality is about people's relationship with our tools. For Illich, tools is everything, from screwdrivers to factories and cars, governments, universities, and volunteer societies. It is anything that human beings have built or organized as a way to extend their impact on the world. The other part of the title, Conviviality, is the word that Illich uses to indicate anything that is good for humanity, whether individuals or community. It includes concepts like freedom, like self-determination, like healthy relationships, cooperation, and healthy communities. Illich says that the key problem in our world is not the ownership of property, disagreeing with Marxists, nor is the distribution of property the only problem, like some socialists might argue. Rather, that our tools are completely out of control. Our tools are too big, too complicated, too specialized, too demanding, and we serve our tools rather than our tools serving us. Tools have eclipsed their intended purpose. To use education as an example, our education system splits us into different castes. The level of education you get defines you as a professional, or a worker, an engineer, or artist, educated or dropout. Education can create opportunities for us, or it can restrict our opportunities. Sometimes both. We're then forced to work in conditions that are dictated by a company's organization, by the products we produce, or the industry, or the regulations that govern that industry, by capital and capitalists. But none of this is our choice, or within our control. In exchange for our services, we are given money, we need it to survive, but that money and spending it then dictates our other purpose in society. We are consumers, and our demand for consumables drives the system. We are not primarily citizens, nor family members, nor even distinct individuals as far as the system is concerned. We aren't completely slaves. After all, we have some freedom to choose anything we want, but only among the choices that are presented to us. Our freedom is highly restricted, and this becomes worse as our tools continue to evolve. No one, from the top to the bottom, has any real control over this situation, although elites do benefit much more than the people at the bottom. Creating tools is quintessentially a human act. Yet here we are, like inhuman robots or like slaves, as serving these tools is very inhuman. It's repetitive, it's boring, it's unconscious, and it's often antisocial. It is a result of this lack of control that we have a permanent underclass, we have unnecessary scarcity, and we have environmental degradation. We are isolated from one another, and we serve endlessly. In the long run, this endlessly growth-oriented system will inevitably threaten our survival as a species. Growth drives overproduction, resource waste, and environmental destruction. Today's humanity is reduced to servitude, not necessarily unpleasant, but servitude nonetheless, and our communities are fragmented. We have learned to depend on the tools we serve, hospitals, governments, companies, and our naturally human interdependence on each other, on community, is dissolved down to a shadow of our evolutionary birthright. The only way out of this inhuman servitude, according to Illich, is to radically reorganize and accept limits on our tools and, inevitably, on our consumption. These limits will reduce the extremes of wealth in the world and will pay dividends by improving quality of life on every other measure. We must embrace a joyous, simpler, and more frugal life if we hope to be truly free. I highly recommend this book to anyone who is looking for a framework to understand our lives in a different way. It does a great job of explaining my particular emotional experience of the world. It helped me to understand why my successful career left me so empty and unhappy. Why have I spent so much of my life feeling lonely? Why has my life felt like a trap that I couldn't escape no matter how hard I worked? Or why I always felt like a puppet being pulled by strings I couldn't see, and how my promised human agency seemed like a lie. This week has seen increasing numbers of Bangladeshis fleeing ahead of worsening flooding as the rainy seasons begin. Meanwhile, a buildup of troops on the Indian side of the border has been attempting to stem the flood of refugees, but so far have been unable to stop repeated breakouts of desperate people. UN troops continue their attempts to reassert control within Bangladesh. Despite many months of foreign troops on the ground, Bangladesh's government remains in a state of total collapse. Yesterday, the Indian government threatened an invasion if the problem could not be solved. The BJP has raised pressure on the UN, condemning the chaos ongoing within their neighbors' borders. Experts on India-Bangladeshi relations report concerns that continued military buildup may lead to an aggressive Indian action within Bangladesh's borders. Meanwhile, Pakistan has reaffirmed its commitment to its Bangladeshi allies. A Pakistani official who requests anonymity told PCC reporters that Pakistan's weak civilian government could not afford to anger their Muslim majority. Pakistanis Muslim nationalists led another day of violent protests in Islamabad, repeating demands that Bangladeshi Muslims be protected from Indian aggression. In the European Union today, the European Farm Protection League claimed responsibility that exploded across France last Thursday. These bombs targeted government buildings and workers, resulting in 200 injured and 30 people killed. This has been the worst attack seen on French soil the past 5 weeks of relative quiet. As increasing temperatures continue to ravage French crops across southern France, the EFPL charged the French government with a complete failure to protect farms and farm workers. They stated that violent action would continue until French authorities agreed to a €10 trillion support package. In other top headlines, Florida's Governor George P. Bush announced a plan to reinforce the state's failing seawalls. Florida's beleaguered defenses continue to fail as sea level rises, exceeding forecasts by up to 5 inches. Existing seawalls, completed 5 years ago at a cost of $1 trillion, were expected to last until the end of the century. Experts state another unprecedented hurricane season is likely to cause 150 miles of existing sea defenses to fail, threatening the homes, livelihoods, and lives of Floridians living along the coasts. President Barron Trump advises Floridians to pray, adding he stands to lose tens of millions of dollars if Mar-a-Lago is also flooded. In this video, I'll be much more critical of Illich than in the last one. I still think the man is a genius and someone who sees the bullshit and gives us new perspective. But like any theorist, I don't think Illich has all the answers, and I think he has some inner biases that shape his advice in directions that I find uncomfortable. What I didn't deal with in my last video was Illich's recommendations for change. With any systemic analysis, and especially one with such an all-encompassing scope, it is incredibly compelling as a system of explanation, but it is difficult to see what can be done to change it. If you're like me, you read Illich and say, yes, this is a good explanation of what's wrong. Your immediate next reaction is, well, fuck it, I want to rebel and change things. But to escape the system, our entire approach to large-scale tools would need to be inverted. Illich's word, not mine. So literally, how we approach problems and the solutions that we choose will need to be done completely differently. This is a huge change because we aren't starting through a change just to government. We are changing society itself. We're changing our behavior and we're changing our common assumptions about the world. In this video, this recommended change will be my focus. I have a second motive for this video. I've recently asked on Reddit for feedback on my channel, and one of the comments was, what we really need aren't complaints, but actual ideas to change. I thought this was solid advice. So as a first step, when I come across ideas to change, I will present them. Eventually, especially if this channel gains traction, I will be looking to speak with social rebels and profile actual alternative lifestyle experiments. I will upload a follow-up video to this one and lay out what I think we can take away from tools from Conviviality, while today I'm focused on what we can leave behind. So back to the book. Illich is very clear in laying out his objectives. The first objective is not to lay out any fictional future community. He's trying to lay out a procedure that future communities can use to create their own convivial social arrangements. While Illich says this is his objective, I think there is no doubt that he has some definite ideas about what a unique future community might look like. His wording suggests that he is open to many communities, and each of those communities would be unique. They are diverse in their makeup, their way of governing themselves, and I'd assume variable in defining convivial life and convivial tools. Common to all the communities is limits on tools and limits on consumption. As well, Illich references mutual support enough times to suggest that this community would be a socialist one, although not necessarily with communal ownership of property. I also believe that this definition of convivial tools suggests that the communities would be limited in size, not requiring any significantly large or complex government structure. It is clear that he is highly skeptical of bureaucracy and any other type of large-scale organization. I wouldn't go so far as to ascribe a political affiliation to Illich, but others have noted that he was close with left anarchist thinkers. I believe that his convivial world would fit comfortably with some types of anarchism. In his third objective, Illich explicitly says that he is not trying to create an engineering manual for convivial tools or institutions. He is trying to raise consciousness, that a society where people experience the, quote, sober joys of life in this voluntary, though relatively poor society, lies within our grasp, close quote. This seems to be an instance where his stated objectives appear quite modest. He isn't trying to define what tools or institutions are ideal for people, rather trying to encourage people to see the problems with our current tools and institutions, thereby encouraging change. Later in the book, Illich makes it clear that he believes constraints on individuals' material goods are inevitable if humanity is to survive in the long run. This is a perfectly reasonable conclusion based on his perspective, and my reading of the book implies that Illich is biased to concluding that a materialistically simple life is always preferable to our current lives. 3. Illich has an objective of focusing on the structure of tools, not on their uses. He believes that societies are becoming increasingly similar, and this homogenization is driven by modern tools. Quote, identical tools also promote the development of the same character types. Policemen in patrol cars or accountants at computers look and act alike all over the world, while their poor cousins using nightsticks or pen are different from region to region, close quote. But, quote, a pluralism of limited tools and of convivial commonweals would of necessity encourage a diversity of lifestyles, close quote. Essentially, he is arguing that you don't start by changing people, but you create multiple societies to fit all people. Constraint is required, but the rest is undefined. Illich is explicitly trying not to define how people should act or how they should interact. He believes that our institutions and technologies are causing an erosion of our diversity. Getting the tools under control gives us back individual choice. Illich, as I've already stated, is not a Marxist, but he does seem very comfortable with Marxist historical materialism. Human beings, and especially human societies, are shaped by their production and material conditions. Society is a product of our economic activity. I will note that Illich writes that he believes Marx is wrong. Ownership is not the issue that leads to scarcity and slavery. Rather, it's the tools that we use. Change the tools and we're free. Once free, humans will choose for themselves how they live and what communities they build. There will be an explosion of diversity. 4. Illich wants to avoid discussing political strategies or tactics. He asserts that no current government has the power to overthrow the current system because the elites of our society, quote, managers of our major tool nations, corporations, parties, structured movements, professions, hold power. This power is vested in the maintenance of growth-oriented structures which they manipulate, but they have no power to reverse the basic structure of the institutional arrangements which they manage, close quote. He does argue that these elites must be eliminated, but that cannot be done through slaughter or forced application of a new structured power. Implementing any new structured system will only result in a new elite rising from that overthrow. Rather, once the machinery that makes modern management necessary is gone, then the elites will also go away. Illich goes further with his refusal to endorse any political system, saying that convivial modes of production would not require a specific form of government, nor rule out, quote, a world federation, global cooperation, or most traditional forms of governance, close quote. The message here seems quite open-ended, at least at first glance. But it is implicitly clear that Illich favors a bottom-up political system, and his examples of global federation, global cooperation, and traditional forms suggests a potential vision for how that might be structured. I think he is suggesting that the most important type of polity is the smaller community. Limited in consumption, limited in formal organization, and favoring a very distributed type of decision-making. but also establishing a society of communities that negotiate how groups interact and agree on some type of global cooperation. To speculate wildly, I'd say he favors a distributed type of political system combined with a loose federalism, anarchistic, but with a limited global authority to manage disputes. In objective number 5, Illich outlines his strong support for distributory and participatory justice. Participatory justice comes automatically from designing convivial tools. Also, probably why he implies that smaller communities are important. The individual voices within that community are not drowned out as they would be in a larger structure. Distributory justice, that everyone in every community gets access to the tools and resources necessary to maintain it, at a minimum, is also critical to his new system. Again, to speculate wildly, I'd suggest that he is implying a global federation of communities would overarch these smaller communities and specifically be responsible for babysitting distributory justice. At a global level, each community could plead for assistance to ensure distributory justice across the communities. In the book, Illich does talk about how modern corporations act to destroy national borders, as their power can play one nation-state against another. But I don't think he is championing current nation-states nor aligning with any type of nationalism. Instead, he is saying that people in one community can limit the freedom of others. For instance, river damming, where an upstream community could limit water to a downstream community. Some judicial body would need to be able to intervene to stop potential conflict and to ensure the maintenance of distributory justice. Number 6. Illich says he is not trying to set out a new economic system. He does say there needs to be a new economic system defined for a convivial society. But he proposes that a dimensional analysis is conducted to understand what variables upset the balance of life, and a political process is created to address these situations. I had to look up dimensional analysis, and the internet says that dimensional analysis is a mathematical analysis used in science and engineering where the relationships of physical qualities are compared. I find this a bit confusing when we're talking about conviviality, which is a subjective human experience, but I assume that Illich is saying that we compare tools and communities. We see how each is contributing or detracting from convivial freedom and build our economic system to address any issues. Illich's contribution to this economic system is a set of negative criteria: that we must accept limits to consumption and production, with protection of human freedom and human needs taking precedence over other concerns. I have to conclude that Illich's economics is the study of distribution, and that he argues mechanics of redistribution has to be added to the system in order to maintain stability and justice. In breaking news, the wake of worsening tensions between India and Pakistan over the Bangladeshi crisis. Fighting has broken out in the contested Kashmir region between the two countries. Indian authorities blame Pakistan's aggressive military stance as the cause of renewed fighting, while Pakistan's Foreign Affairs Minister Yusuf Khan has said that India's continued support for Hindu guerrillas within the contested region has left Pakistan no choice but to increase military resources within the area. The UK election has been won in an unexpected landslide for the far-right BNP. BNP leader Richard Tetbell Jr. ran on a platform of complete closure for UK borders, banning entry by all travelers with the exception of Kanzuk nations. Ted Bell also promised the deployment of 10th generation lethal drone to patrol the English Channel. Defeated leader of the Conservative Party, Betty Feelsbottom, has decried the policy as a direct violation of the UN's Refugee Convention and pleading for restraint. A majority of Britons were found in favor of the deployment, according to recent polls. In other news, Canada has agreed to take 100,000 additional climate refugees. All refugees have been required to sign a compulsory 5-year commitment into Canada's Emergency Forest Fire Fighting Force. In Germany this week, fighting has resumed between extreme environmentalist group Fichte Menschen and government forces. The FDM vowed to keep fighting until the German government agrees to complete deindustrialization of the country. The FDM are among the most radical of a recent European upswing in environmental terrorism. The European Parliament, fearing further assassinations, has advised all senior business leaders to avoid public places and tighten security. So at this point, with Illich's objectives setting our goalposts, I'm going to move on to his vision for a possible better future. He outlines this future in the last 25% of Tools for Conviviality. It remains pretty vague, and I think deliberately, but Illich does give us his view of how conviviality can be implemented. This begins in section 4 of the book under the heading Recovery. Section 4 has been split into 3 subsections. First, demythalization of science. Second, rediscovery of language. And third, recovery of legal procedure. These subsections identify the developments that are a necessary precondition to implementing Illich's vision. Demythalization of science picks up on a central theme of the book: the growth of professionalism, of specialization, and of expertise has alienated most people from parts of their own lives. For instance, we turn over management of our health to doctors and health institutions. We believe that most decisions we make about our health should be approved by an expert, if not completely decided by a doctor. We allow our elderly parents to die in a palliative care unit rather than trying to make them comfortable at home surrounded by familiar faces. Illich feels that this makes healthcare too exclusive and expensive, as well as creating dependence on too few experts who are authorized to practice. This professionalism creates a shortage, limiting access to those with money or government money. Whereas the most important parts of health are relatively simple and better handled by widely distributed community services or educated individuals, i.e. diet, hygiene, our lifestyle, having childbirth supported by midwives, etc. The overall effect of dependence on professionals central to every aspect of our society has resulted in making the majority either unable to decide for themselves or, quote, undermines their belief that they can decide, unquote. This undermines a community level of self-governance because, quote, only a political community can dialectically choose the dimensions of the roof under which its members live, unquote. But we have deferred to experts. These experts are certified by institutions that are only out-of-control tools. This point is, to my mind, relatively solid. Healthcare is ruinously expensive in countries where it is private, and massively problematic in countries with public health care. Although I still maintain that public health care is way better in every measure except perhaps speed and flexibility. Both systems have issues with shortages in some way or another. Both systems can make medical services a challenge to access. Illich is saying that we need to involve more people in healthcare and relax some of the exclusivity given to experts so that people can turn to others for help more readily and cheaply. That people who are caring and have an interest should be encouraged to get involved rather than barred by exclusionary institutions like the insanely competitive medical universities. Illich is relaxing certification and education requirements because he is arguing that wide participation in every aspect of community is critical to a truly participatory governance model. In the next subsection, Rediscovery of Language, Illich complains that language itself has taken on the, quote, materialization of consciousness, unquote, reflecting our out-of-control tools and obsessively growth-biased system. Language is important to how we think. Literally, language is the data our frontal cortex processes, and language allows thinking clearly or critically. Insufficient language will handicap clear thinking. Unbiased specific language will allow greater clarity. Putting insufficient language into our brain is like putting the wrong numbers into a calculator. You will get an answer, but it is the wrong answer. Illich points out that our language has changed as our modern system has evolved. So we have turned many verbs into nouns. To get educated becomes my education. To travel becomes my transportation. To be entertained becomes my entertainment. In this way, we've gone from being actors who learn, who travel, who are entertained, into consumers who purchase education, transportation, or entertainment for the purposes of consumption. Capitalism has, in this way, become a mind control cult. The majority of people simply accept that they are consumers and forget the full range of being individuals and citizens. Illich believes that we need to agree on and use language that helps us to see the world transcendent the purely material necessities of production, economic growth, and consumption. In the third recovery subsection, Recovery of Legal Procedure, Illich lays out his belief that the legal system is underpinned by workable processes, that the legal system is as able to be effective in a convivial society as in our current one. He writes that the legal system often acts in favor of the current social structure, protects capital, corporations, and exploitation, on the basis that all participants in that system are embedded in and reflect our current non-convivial system. Judges, lawyers, and lawmakers all allow their adopted beliefs to drive the decisions that they make, just as we all do. However, Illich believes that the adversarial legal system, with its preference for facts and a dependence on precedents, makes that system useful in his new convivial society. Once there is a change to common community beliefs, to community governance, and to a defined set of rules that protect this new system, the legal system will reflect those conditions just as well as it reflects current conditions. For Illich, there is a theme of protecting past human practice, agreed morality, and institutions where precedence has demonstrated good outcomes. While Illich's thesis in Tools for Conviviality is very revolutionary versus current society, there is still a quite concrete conservative theme that anchors his recommendations. In some ways, the priest is quite faithful to the past. This just in. Open hostilities have broken out in the disputed Kashmir region between Pakistan and India. These increasing hostilities have come in the wake of India's land invasion of Bangladesh. Pakistani military convoys continue to roll into the disputed region despite repeated airstrike by India's Air Force. Pakistan's new military junta has reaffirmed their intention to fully absorb the contested region. India, facing a two-front military action, has requested support from allies. These two nuclear powers seem intent on escalating the first open conflict to rock the subcontinent in many decades. Keep tuned to PCC as we will be monitoring the situation carefully. By the time we reach the final section of the book, Illich has defined what he hopes to achieve in his objectives and outlined some preconditions in his recovery section. The fifth and final section of the book, Political Inversion, is his outline of how he envisions his revolution happening. To be honest, despite some solid ideas and my general admiration for this author, I completely part ways with Illich at this point. Nonetheless, here it is. Political Inversion contains 4 subsections: myth and majorities, breakdown and chaos, insight into crisis, and finally, sudden change. The myth in Myth and Majorities is that we lack enough wise people to support limits on individual consumption. The myth goes like this: almost everyone in rich societies is a destructive consumer. So destructive consumers constitute a numerical majority, a voting bloc, that would oppose change and are the guardians of endless economic growth. Illich contends, on closer inspection, you will find ecologists who take planes to conferences on protecting the environment, and tailored suit-wearing economists who are nonetheless quite concerned with growing inequality. These two well-educated elite have nothing in common with a high school dropout living in a slum in Detroit, and the three are certainly not a homogenized political bloc. But, Illich writes, they can be driven into a voting bloc by 2 external factors. First, an issue at hand becoming so important that it demands attention. And second is the emergence of influential spokespeople who provide convincing interpretive frameworks. These factors allow for a new alignment of interest. History seems to provide evidence to support this statement. The repeated labor strife of the 19th and 20th centuries was a crisis that raised awareness of working conditions and poverty in Europe and North America, while the union movement and socialist theorists provided a framework to interpret this issue. The result was rapid political support for change and the emergence of a pro-labor welfare state. These changes did not directly benefit elites, yet a significant portion of the elite were supportive. So, Illich's argument isn't wild. We have a level of awareness of the problems in our current modern societies, and there are many of us who want change, despite our current comfort. But we need compelling leadership presenting us an attractive message of change. In subsection 2, Breakdown and Chaos, Illich moves from the present into a projection of the future. He writes, quote, I believe that growth will grind to a halt. The total collapse of the industrial monopoly on production will be the result of a synergy in the failure of multiple systems that fed its expansion. Almost overnight, people lose confidence not only in the major institutions, but also in the miracle prescriptions of the would-be crisis managers, unquote. Our author is predicting that a great economic crisis is the likely cause of loss of faith in the current system. He advises that our preparedness, and by our, I'm assuming he means people who have read his book, as one of the many, quote, submerged social groups, unquote, is critical. We have to be ready to explain how this disaster happened and what we can do to set things right again. This is important as other alternative systems and their supporters will offer competing explanations. If we want to enact convivial social change, then this loss of faith is our action call and requires us to become ready to step up to the challenge. As faith in the establishment lapses, many minority opinions can become influential. Given the amount of economic upheaval that we've seen in the past 2 decades, perhaps we are in the early throes of the breakdown Illich was predicting. In Insight into Crisis, the 3rd subsection, Illich describes how people's loss of faith can be shaped into a force for positive change. Quote, forces trending to limit production are already at work within society. we can anticipate that their voices will acquire new resonance when the crisis of overproductive society becomes acute, unquote. This crisis must be significant and further growth must lead to multiple catastrophes. Otherwise, people won't, quote, accept multiple limits to growth, unquote. This crisis will be an opportunity for choice only if necessary social demands can be effectively expressed. They must be represented by people who can demonstrate the breakdown of the current industrial illusion is for them a condition for choosing an effective and convivial mode of production. The preparation of such groups is the key task of new politics at the present moment, unquote. Illich goes on to clarify that these groups need to be both clear-thinking and feeling people, that they need to enact, quote, the conscious use of procedure in a continually anti-bureaucratic sense, ensuring protection against the revolution itself becoming an institution, unquote. I think this is a good section, if a bit hopeful. From Illich's point of view, there needs to be a crisis to force people to reject their indoctrination into the current system. But those of us who are already highly critical have a role to play immediately. Illich is arguing that the left needs to organize itself into a force of education and communication, that when the crisis creates an opportunity for change, we're ready to lead humanity into a healthier, convivial future. As well, he is arguing that our preparedness is a bulwark against this change becoming a new excuse for repression and control. Sudden change is the fourth and final subsection and the closing section of the book. It also increases my discomfort with Illich's vision for the future. He states that the proponents of a bounded, a limited production and consumption society don't need to create a voting majority, but they must win support through the utter failure and disillusionment among the majority with the current system. Illich states that the proponents of a bounded society don't need to create a voting majority, but they must win support through the utter failure and disillusionment of the majority with the current system. Essentially, that we must be ready to capitalize on a future protest vote. At that point, using the legal system and creating an appropriate constitution becomes a viable possibility. Appealing to the justice system and generally respected procedures is one way to subdue the possibility of mass violence, while also winning majority approval. I think in this case what Illich is saying is that popular will drives change, but the existing judicial system, supported by a new or modified constitution, becomes the underlying security that lends the new system authority. Illich asserts that the majority still hold the legal system in very high regard. They are more likely to trust the legal system than they are to trust other types of leadership. But Illich also warns that a crisis of this type, quote, could easily lead to one-man rule, expert government, and ideological orthodoxy, close quote. Effectively, he's reminding us about the need to be prepared and to lead change. Otherwise, the change will be led in dangerous directions. The Crisis Committee of the federal government is ordering all citizens to remain in their homes for a national shelter-in-place order. Nuclear fallout from the India-Pakistan war is expected to reach North American shores by 8 a.m. EST. This fallout is expected to be worsened by snow, rain, or any other precipitation event. It will bring with it extreme health risks to anyone in direct contact. Our military and other uniformed officials have been deployed to all major urban areas in order to ensure calm and enforcement of the shelter-in-place order. Please stay calm, stay at home, and keep your families safe. Stay tuned to this station for further updates and instructions. At this point, I think I've made it really clear that I'm a huge fan of Illich. I think his criticism of our current life is one of the most novel and convincing that I've read, at least so far. At the same time, I'm not at all convinced by his recommendation for leading positive change. Illich positioned some of his recommendations in ways very similar to many other left-wing thinkers. He focuses on deep, complicated, and easily misunderstood theory at the expense of immediate action, and an excessively positive view of humanity. Illich recommends that our immediate action should be to form groups that educate ourselves and prepare ourselves to lead at the time of a future crisis. This preparation is focused on understanding the failures of the current system and also requires the development of a new set of economics, a new legal system underpinned by a new constitution, and new political procedures. And I have massive problems with this mostly passive response to our current situation. First of all, it presupposes that we can develop a new system of economics prior to any implementation and based on a dimensional analysis. I would argue that history indicates this just isn't how things work. Soviet-style managed economies have failed. And while that doesn't prove my point, it does provide scant evidence for the success of planned economic systems. The remaining communist countries are often simply the worst of capitalism merged with interventionist dictatorships. Whereas capitalism is an enormously successful system in many ways, even if horrific in others. And capitalism is also an organic creation driven by social change, technological change, and one could argue pure happenstance, like the Black Death in Europe. We've certainly nudged capitalism in certain directions through political intervention, but ultimately it is mostly a spontaneous phenomenon. Modern capitalism, as explained even by its earliest student Adam Smith, is described as existing, not as being invented. The best of our current economic theory maintains this view, somewhat successfully. My concern is that trying to define the ideal economic system is a surefire way to stir up controversy, and a surefire way to waste endless amounts of time without ever reaching a consensus, especially if we're involving already factious leftist intellectuals. Illich recommends that we need to wait until there is a disastrous collapse of the current system before we can spring into action. Again, waiting is the strategy of defeat. I think this collapse is predicated on Illich's belief that it was imminent, and he was simply wrong. He writes, quote, "The convergence of population growth and the failure of the Green Revolution, which guarantees that feeding people now will escalate starvation by 1985, unquote. This didn't happen, and our ability to technologically solve resource problems clearly exceeded his pessimistic outlook. Also, in several places, he mentions how our addiction to growth drives the overconsumption of resources and massive environmental degradation that is bound to lead to catastrophe and either abandonment of the system or mass extinction of humanity. Here in 2021, almost 50 years after the book was written, it is clear that Illich underestimated the resilience of capitalism and the resilience of the environment. Where the failure predictions are extremely dangerous is an assumption that failure of our system will happen while we're still in a position to enact successful change. Climate change, for example, seems to be accelerating and is subject to a tipping point that may make this crisis self-sustaining. It seems possible that we might reach a point of complete irreversible disaster long before capitalism and our current social order is ready to fail. I don't think that food shortages, mass migration, and the conflict that are associated are at all ideal conditions to implement any future society. This general passivity in Illich's recommendations are made much more dangerous by his possibly overly optimistic view of humanity. As long as human beings have existed, we've been arguing whether human beings are primarily good and altruistic or primarily bad and selfish. At the risk of oversimplifying, I believe the reason we're still arguing is because both types of humanities are true. We are self-interested and altruistic. We are good and bad. More than anything else, we are unpredictable. This optimism convinced Illich that when presented with massive global problems and the collapse of our system, people can be persuaded to accept significant constraints on the technology they use and on their consumption. This may be true, but is probably only true for a portion of humanity and only under very specific circumstances. For the poor and a substantial portion of the middle class, restrictions of this type aren't necessarily all that painful. In fact, they might be more attractive than our current system. But for the rich, the larger their wealth, the greater the sacrifice. Can people accept this kind of sacrifice? The best we can say is maybe. There will be those who would argue that the sacrifice is unnecessary, just as there will be leaders who can explain the collapse by shifting blame, encouraging selfishness, and stirring resentments. Every aspect of humanity will find its justification if it looks hard enough. We need to remember that the Nazis rose out of a sense of frustration, as did the current welfare state. Illich also seems biased to the ideas he recommends, and I would suggest this makes him somewhat blind to the opposition his ideas will face. Illich is a Catholic priest, and he's advising people to experience the sober joy of relative poverty. Doesn't this definitely have a Catholic tinge? I'm not suggesting that Illich is trying to sneak Catholic theology into his philosophy, as I don't think he is, deliberately. I will suggest that asceticism might be far more comfortable as a conclusion for a Catholic priest than for the public in general, where a secular thinker might be extremely careful to define why relative poverty is necessary and why it is still more fulfilling and happy than our current materialistic life. Illich is simply unconcerned. Illich has a similarly positive outlook on participatory justice. As example, consider his criticism of professionalism in healthcare. The current healthcare system is far from perfect. At the same time, there is a profusion of complete quacks. We've seen far too many individuals peddling all sorts of crazy, if not dangerous, ideas about health. Certification of expert healthcare practitioners gives us assurance that we are getting the best support available. If everyone was well-meaning and used the best possible information, then wider participation in healthcare is clearly beneficial. But Illich's point is a possibly dangerous one. It would be insane if we ignored the fact that some individuals are less capable of making good decisions than others. Not all bad outcomes are systemic, and some myths are just stories to protect us from idiots. When you combine Illich's recommendation of waiting with his generally good view of humanity, I think you arrive at a recommendation that is both optimistic and highly dangerous. Extreme crisis is a time of fear and chaos. This is exactly the wrong time to get human beings to make fully rational choices, especially if simple, attractive, easy solutions are offered as alternatives. You know, the kill the insert scapegoat minority group here, and suddenly everyone will be rich and happy again, is always a more attractive proposition to some people than saying, Okay, everybody gets to live in a bit of poverty, but I promise you'll love it. Even Illich himself points out that crisis could lead to totalitarianism. For those who are predisposed to Illich's strategy, I have 3 words: Donald fucking Trump. Finally, it could be argued that in fact Illich is proposing a return to a simpler and ascetic lifestyle. His theory could be effectively associated with the past and could be viewed as regressive, especially by people looking to discredit it. Where he sees convivial, enjoyable life, others might see a narrow, stultifying life, where expectations are satisfied because they are low and not because the system is better. The closest cousin to Illich's convivial life is the lifestyle of Old Order Mennonites or certain sects of the Amish. In these communities, there is an annual meeting where the community itself decides on a lifestyle and technologies that it will adopt or forego. These meetings are specifically about restricting the use of tools in order to protect the community. Illustrated this way, I think your average web browsing, latte swilling, cell phone addicted man is going to be highly skeptical. As with any theory, Illich has the elements that will incite the closed-minded, the self-interested, and the stupid to reject without consideration. It is from these points of view where I have to walk a different path than Illich. In my next video on this topic, I will be expanding on where I think Illich presents important observations and recommendations for a much better way of life. At the same time, I will also throw out some of my own pet theories on how we might proceed immediately rather than waiting for some future disaster. So as always, I am so grateful for you, my viewers, who have watched this through to the end. If you enjoyed this video and you want more content like it, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe. This is XCG, wishing all of you success on your journey to freedom.